Welcome to Mix Elite. All-in-one platform with ongoing education, access to all and new courses and packs, weekly live coaching with daily office hours to the community, with me and the team, unlimited personal feedback on your music with actionable homework where you get targeted tips from our team with no limits. So you hear daily improvements and we don't stop until you meet your goals. Just click the first link below. Let's dive in. Your mix starts with sub frequencies and those are under 60, 80 hertz and you don't really hear them, you feel them, and those are the frequencies that make people go wow. They also have the longest waves, that's why it's so hard to dampen them, and that's why you will hear your neighbors sub and not high frequencies or mid frequencies. So they're really hard to kill. That's why in our mixes, if we want to have punchy and groovy track, we need to keep the sub very tight and clean. They also need a lot more volume to be audible. As you can see the equal loudness curves on the infographic you're about to get, you need to play sub frequencies that much louder than, for example, frequencies around 4K hertz to be equally audible. First of all, we always want to make sure we sidechain our bass equally to the length of our kick. So if you do your sidechain like this, it's easier to see, so you can match the length of the kick. Make sure that just before we go back to zero volume, to do it gradually, so you don't cut the waveform in the middle. And then also we need to ask ourselves if we want to have longer kick, which will be more kind of like big room style, or if you want to have, tighter and more groovy track, that's where we'll use a lot shorter kick. That's why I'll drag it just like this. Also now we want to reflect that with our sidechain. What I like to do to keep it pumping, but not so much, I like to do like two-step sidechain and make it go gradually like this. Sub is actually very simple. What you cannot go wrong with is triangle wave to feel a little bit more of the frequencies and make it feel more full. Sub also has different perceived loudnesses depending on the note you play. There's so many factors coming to play why that is, from the size of your room to, again, the equal loudness contour. Now, the second step will be our bass, from about 60, 80 to 250. And what I found is the most common problem in bass is little to none of it. I suspect that's because most people's rooms resonate about 120 hertz. If you want to test your room where it resonates, you can just take serum or something and when you hear at one point the sound is very, very loud, that's where your room resonates, and that's when you can actually use some software and measure your room, and it will apply just EQ curve so you can mix in your room with much higher precision. So in our case, we don't have any bass, and that's where you would add it, or if you're lazy, you would just add some distortion over your sub. What I like to make is just add a little bit of white noise and distort both white noise and sub together. So without, it sounds like this. And after, some distortion. And then when you listen to it in the mix, you can then decide how much of this bass you actually want. But as I said, there are two types of people. One puts a lot of sub and the second puts a lot of bass. And if you added a ton of bass, it's really hard to hear that you don't have enough sub. That's why you always, check your mix on different listening environments. And also you can use tonal balance control, or if you have span, we also have a free noise that you can reference to. We've added distortion to our sub and now we can hear it actually much better, and that's when we come to the place where we need to tighten up our sub. And as we said, sub frequencies are so long it's hard to dampen them. We need to make sure we control the length of our sub. So one way to deal with this, a lot of people do, is actually lower the volume of sub and bass just before the next kick. This will make your track feel a lot more groovy and feel much better in scenarios like club, for example. That's one way to do it. And another way would be just, to play with your release and maybe do some kind of like hybrid of this technique. Now low mid is your muddiness. It's somewhere around 200, 250 to 500 hertz. So to keep this minimal, you will first want to find an element that has the most of it. Now, of course, we'd like to start with frequency masking the elements, right? So sub already has sub. So we don't want this in our mid bass, but also the muddiness you'll find in the side or the stereo of your mix. So cool fix would be applying something like mid-side EQ, like this one, and now checking the mid-side, which is, the power here. We would definitely want to get rid of the sub. And then the same thing we will do, maybe a little bit even higher with side. So in the side channel, we would cut the low mid and leave it in the low mid only. Or in our case, we only really have 2 or 3 elements taking up this space, so we don't really have to clean it up that much. We could leave some of the low mid on the side and also on the mid. But to keep this minimal, we could lower it just a few dBs. And then we'll find our lead. That definitely doesn't need that much of the low mid. Let's try. Much cleaner. So that's before. Now mid is your meat of your track. Most people think that bass heavy music means less meats, which is not true at all, and if you reference to any bass heavy track, it's all balanced, and sometimes there's even more mids than you think. Mids can be simpler but not quieter. They go from 500 Hz to 2K Hertz. And the cause of the problem again lies in every possible corner that you might think about. There's even a Wikipedia page for a smiley face curve where you literally just take everything up other than mids. They also write here that it's kind of like compensation for the equal loudness contour, and it's pretty much right up until you don't start to listen to it on high volume, right? So in scenario like this, even though we've added those elements that occupy the mid frequencies and are like our meat of our track, if we had vocals, then vocals would occupy most of the space. But if we turn on tonal balance control, going from 2K Hertz, it should go like this, but it starts to go sideways a lot more. And that means we lack a ton of mids. There's a lot of ways to fix mids and make your track balanced. One of them is definitely just turning up the mids in the elements only, of course, that occupy those. On chords. This is really drastic, and a psycho would tell you lower your highs instead. But it's literally the same thing if you just took the highs down and put up the volume of the whole thing, okay? Just don't listen to everyone on the internet, and now we'll just put the sub all the way up.
Absolutely. As much.
So we can do this here. An awesome way is also to just add distortion. It adds those mid harmonies in. Also, please make sure to just high pass everything that doesn't need those bass frequencies. Let's take a look at our balance control. What else I like to do is just push up the mids a little bit here. And remember that you don't have to worry about boosting stuff on the master. If you applied perfect frequency masking into every single instrument of your track, it really doesn't matter if you do it on the master, okay? So that's before and after. Also, mids are the most important when you have vocals. And one of the most important tricks to keep everything balanced is try to use some multiband sidechain compression from your vocals to your instruments. That would be just linking all of your instruments into one bus. And then we would take our vocal and sidechain to the instruments and apply something like soothy. Now in the processing here, make sure it's set to vocal. And what I like to do is also increase a little bit of the release, take the sharpness down, and of course, mark sidechain. Now, your vocal will have also a lot of S's, and we don't necessarily, need to hide the instrumental high frequencies when the person is saying SSS, right? So we would like to just like cover those around 500 to 2K hertz. Those are our mids. So that's what's happening.
You did, wait, you did. You did, wait. You did.
We just make it, of course, work up to like 3 or 6 dB. Make sure that the signal you're sending from vocals to instruments doesn't have any reverb. Now, high mids is your dirtiness or your harshness. One is good, one is bad. These frequencies are, for example, the S's of the vocals, which would be harshness, but it also can be shakers. And most common problem is actually harshness. So people will take down the high mids and will not necessarily hear that they lack it. So I want you to learn to listen if you lack each of those frequencies we've talked about today. On the master, we can hear that there are some cool elements that we could bring up, but there are also some harsh elements that we could bring down. Stuff like risers, for example. Right? So we could make these frequencies in this element a little bit quieter, but for example, in our top loop, we have some really nice shakers going around there. Let's listen. In that case, we definitely want this dirtiness in our track. Now for something like vocal.
Crushing so slowly, it's not going to work. Don't wait for excuse.
Different vocalists will have different place where their harsh S is at, right? For example, in that case, we have it more around 6K hertz.
Crushing so slowly.
Soothy, for example, would make a great work here. We could even choose some preset that has vocals on it, right? And that does a lot of work.
Crushing so slowly.
So before.
Crushing so slowly.
After.
Crushing so slowly. It's not
much more balanced. And highs, this is your sparkle, this is your brightness. They go from about 4K to 20K hertz. What a lot of people do to make their mixes more bright, they just put up the trebles like this. And the worst thing about that is when you actually try to listen what you're actually boosting, this will cause so much ear fatigue and is generally not recommended to even have in your final mix. A lot of mastering engineers will just cut everything out after 16K hertz, not 18, 16. I'm not telling you to roll off everything from your highs. What I suggest you to do if you want to boost the brightness, use bell instead and boost around 12K, and it will be much better. What people also do, even on the masters, do something like this, so they make sure they don't boost anything after 16 about hertz. However, highs are definitely much harder to screw up, right? In sub and bass, we even have to sometimes, look at the waveforms and make sure that kick and bass don't phase with each other. Here we have a little bit more room to screw up. However, we don't screw up here because the next tip is if you want to add more brightness to your highs, for example, find an element that has brightness and apply distortion only to highs. You can do that, for example, with Saturn. So you're not only boosting those frequencies, you're also adding harmonics in between them, so it also sounds more rich. From highs, I really want you to remember that also they can build up very, very quickly. So even though we have more room to screw up, treat them as carefully as low end. So don't have too many elements occupy it. If you have a lot of synths, for example, and hats, cut after 16 Hz from one of those elements, okay? A great tip for non-ear piercing highs is also to take care of your dynamics. Of course, dynamics is a whole another concept, but for highs, let's listen to how it sounds if we would just take out the very peaks of those hats. And it really depends on what kind of style you're striving for here. Here you can download your infographic, and I'm sure it's going to help you get your mixes to a whole another level.